Welcome to the Living After Faith podcast, here to help you recover from the damage of religion and move forward with your life, putting the emphasis on living after faith. This is the official podcast of recoveringfromreligion.org. Now with today's program on Living After Faith, here's Rich and Deanna Joy Lyons.
I'm Rich Lyons.
I'm Deanna Joy Lyons.
Come laugh with me.
Today we have a special guest. Daniel Dennett is professor of philosophy and co-director of the Center for Cognitive Studies at Tufts University. His books include Brainstorms, Elbow Room, Consciousness Explained, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, of course, Breaking the Spell, and his latest book is Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking. We are so delighted to have him here with us today as a man who knows a lot about thinking and does a lot of talking about thinking.
And of course, also Daniel Dennett. If you've heard us talk about the Clergy Project, a lot of, actually the beginning of the Clergy Project started with Daniel Dennett.
He and Linda LaScola started the original early study, which led to the Clergy Project becoming an online community. And, you know, we've talked about that a lot. It's a valuable resource.
Welcome to Living After Faith.
I'm delighted to be with you, Rich, and Deanna Joy.
Before we get started really in the interview, and there are a lot of things I want to talk about, I want to thank you first. The Clergy Project is probably the most outstanding thing I think that atheism has going for it right now. And as a part of that, I'm not really active. I was out of the ministry before Clergy Project started, but I followed it and am a member now. And thank you so much for having the foresight. When I first heard about it, I thought, I was the only one. There aren't that many. Okay, yeah, there was Dan Barker, and okay, I met Robert Parham, but to realize that there are hundreds blows my mind.
Well, I had a small role in getting it started. Linda and I talked to Richard Dawkins and the Dawkins Foundation. Richard and I had talked about trying to do something like that some years ago, but this was now the opportunity to make it happen. And of course, it's all completely run by the pastors themselves, the members, and I have no access to it. I only know what they choose to tell me. Every week or two, I'll get some little report from one of the people there about how it's going. I've been very proud of the way it's gone, and it seems to be growing steadily and healthily and without any advertising. Just let it grow by word of mouth. I think it's wonderful.
So the original study with Linda LaScola, you had a pretty active part in that, is that right?
Oh yeah, and with the follow-up, which we're working on right now. In fact, just 3 days ago, when I was in Washington, D.C., Linda and I sat down to do a bit of work on our follow-up study, which we're writing up and trying to get ready for publication. The first study was so well received by the people involved that what happened was just what we wanted to happen. Other pastors came out of the woodwork and said, well, you told 5 good stories there, but you haven't heard mine, and I'd like to be interviewed too. So we had plenty of volunteers. We didn't have to go hunting for the second batch. We still haven't got all the denominations that would be interesting, but actually we have just about everything except the one variety that I'm actually scared to try for, and that's an imam. Yes. For the very simple reason that if an imam talked about this to us, his life would be in danger, and I don't think we could. We have very tight security, but I don't think we know enough about it to be able to promise that they couldn't find him if we talked about it. So we've skirted away from that.
Yeah, I could understand that. That's a big risk right there. So when do you expect the new study to come out?
Just as soon as I can find the time from my book tour and other activities to finish with Linda writing it up. We have drafts of about half the chapters and more.
Excellent.
And lots of notes. We've been through all the transcripts, and now it's just a matter of culling and polishing and putting it together and trying to figure out what order to do it in.
Excellent. Yeah, you must be very busy. Tell us a little bit about the new book.
Well, the new book, Intuition Pumps and Other Tools for Thinking, is really the culmination of my whole life's work in academia, because I started devising these thinking tools, intuition pumps, thought experiments, very early in my career, and been developing them and criticizing others for many years. And it struck me that I wanted my fellow philosophers to become more self-conscious about our methods. Oddly enough, philosophers who are supposedly the most self-absorbed, navel-gazing, self-conscious people, they're actually sometimes stunningly unself-conscious about their methods.
Well, they are human.
Yeah, and people in general can not pay attention to how they're actually doing things. And so one of the main points of the book is to get people to pay attention to the ways and means, the actual machinery that they use to try to persuade people of their views. And notice that it's not just formal arguments. Very little of philosophy is ever accomplished by a formal argument. It's little stories, little things like Aesop's fables, except they're our own philosophical intuition pumps. And so this is a collection of intuition pumps and other simpler tools with a commentary and sort of reverse engineering each one, showing how it works, taking it apart, turning the knobs so that we can see what makes it work, and sometimes why it shouldn't work, why it's a ill-designed tool which you shouldn't trust.
I like that a lot.
I find that fascinating.
One of the things that spoke to me so strong in breaking the spell, and our listeners know my background. You may not be familiar. I was a pastor for 20 years until I began, through a series of events, I allowed myself to ask questions. I had never done that. I had always taken the position that far greater men than me have gone through all of this through centuries. Who am I to question what they have discovered and their findings? But through a chain of events, I began to question, and I started reading. I was in Barnes & Noble, and they had a section that had a few atheist books, and I picked up Breaking the Spell. And that book was life-changing to me.
I love to hear that.
When it began to talk about the people in AA, and you pose the question, would it be right to tell a guy who was a drunk or someone who was an alcoholic and credits this higher power, is it right to break their spell? And of course, my first thought was, no, that'll ruin their lives, until you explained that they alone are responsible. They had the strength to do what very few humans can do. And you're robbing them of the knowledge and being able to credit themselves with their own accomplishment. And then when I saw that, it just opened a whole new way, and lots of places in that book. But the reason that I've wanted to have you on this show since we've been doing this show is, to me, I think when someone is coming out of religion, it totally changes your thought process. Everything was filtered through, this is the way God said it has to be. Even thinking. I mean, if I saw an attractive woman, I couldn't think, wow, nice ass. I had to think, well, she's an attractive woman. Because even thinking that God would be watching, and, you can't, God's not into nice asses, I guess. But the whole idea that every person who comes out of religion, especially who are really into it, your whole thought process, everything you've thought through, has to be rethought through.
And the self-censorship that is encouraged is very strong. To me, one of the most interesting patterns that we see in our sample of clergy that we're talking with is when Linda asks them, what are the costs and what are the benefits? What have they gotten out of the discovery that they no longer have faith? Now, these are people that still have parishes in most cases. And again, in spite of the fact that they are now painfully aware of their sort of captivity, their entrapment, what they all say is, oh, the freedom, the sense of being able to think, the freedom of thought is just a joy. And they are really quite rapturous when they describe that. I think that's perhaps the most important point that comes out. The way in which all religions have discovered the trick of making you feel guilty for being skeptical at all, or for even harboring idle thoughts about faith. That's a trick which has worked for several millennia, but I don't think it's going to work any longer. I think that the growing transparency of the world, informational transparency, thanks to the internet and television and cell phones and all the rest, is simply going to make it as good as impossible to keep people isolated from the facts that will at least bother them, get them thinking. I think we have to be very patient. I don't expect instant conversions from people who read my book. I expect, though, a little rumble to start, and then it'll rumble again, and they'll think about it, and a year later another thought will hit them, and gradually they will come to realize that they can think critically and carefully and with a freedom of thought about their predicament, and they can be moral without God.
I think so much breaking the spell, and we will talk about the new book more in depth, but so much about breaking the spell for me was it's a thinking book where, the God delusion, that's information. That's a lot of fact. And your book has that too. But what it really had is it challenged me to think about things I thought I had already knew, about things that I thought were already concrete and put away and couldn't be moved. And I think anyone who reads that, once that thought process starts, we know where it's going to go.
Yeah. Just be patient.
Over and over again, we hear from people, because mostly what we do is we interview people who have lost their faith from all different backgrounds. And there are several themes that come up over and over again. And one of the things is those little bits of doubt that over time, and people will tell us that, ever since they were a teenager, they maybe were in their faith for 20 years after that. But over that whole period, there were questions that they had, and there were little things that bothered them, things like the problem of evil, and they would have these doubts and they would shelve them because they were told those doubts were a sin, to try to question anything about their faith and their church teachings. And they do add up little by little by little. And I wonder if you know much about how brain processes maybe suppress those, or how we end up kind of in those predicaments, or is this just sort of the human experience?
Well, of course, the brain is doing all the processing, but we don't have any details. I don't think anybody has any good details about this. There's no special brain science of religious belief, not yet, although a few people have suggested otherwise. I think that one of the things that we should appreciate is how indirect evidence is in some ways even more potent than direct evidence. You just tell somebody some fact that seems to be relevant, and that may have an effect. But just as effective, sometimes more, is simply them hearing somebody who's clearly a good and intelligent person make some remark which just presupposes, well, of course I don't believe in God. Why would I believe in God? And just the fact that they can express that attitude so casually and in a friendly spirit, that really sinks in sometimes. I mean, oh my goodness. Because they just don't imagine that there are people out there who are leading wonderful lives, very good moral lives, and just, God just doesn't come into it.
And see, that's exactly where I would have been. Raised in the South, lived in the same town, 25,000 people all my life. I did not know another atheist. Now, there probably was someone who really didn't believe, but they really didn't say that either, because you really couldn't say that in that type of a world. And when I remember when I first came out to myself that I was an atheist, I had been having questions, the whole question of evil. And I began to think, if I were omnipotent and I chose to create people, and you go back to the Bible, the purpose of creation was so that he would not be alone, why would I make eternal punishment even part of what I was doing? I mean, how can you be that big an asshole to even that's your thought process? Yes. Okay, here's what I'm going to hide myself the best I can, and the ones who don't believe in me, I get to burn them forever and ever and ever. Yeah. I mean, when I realized God was a bigger asshole than I am, and I know that's harsh, but I realized he also couldn't exist because he could not be that advanced and that much of a jerk at the same time. But I remember looking into the mirror and saying I was the worst a human could be because I had lost my ability to believe in God. And I could not, in my mind, that was the worst a human could be.
In your world, atheists didn't exist.
For one of our pastors in the current study, one of the tipping points for her was going to a Sunday school class in her church, and the kids were all doing Noah's Ark pictures. Of course, it's a great story for Sunday school because you get to draw all the animals and boats and everything. This is a favorite always. And all of a sudden, it just hit her like a ton of bricks. How harsh is this God who kills all the people? His mistake. Oops, kill him, start over. That the horror of the story of Noah's Ark suddenly hit her as it never had before, and she suddenly felt very embarrassed that she was teaching this story as truth to these kids. She wasn't, the Sunday school teachers were. But it's little moments like that which make a big difference.
I had questions about the Noah's Ark story from a very young age. I went to a Methodist church in a fairly liberal, not very literalist environment at all. But it was taught as something that actually happened. And, I kept thinking, boy, how did they get all those animals on that boat? I mean, there's so many animals in the world. I had a Zoo Books subscription, the magazine. Every month you get a different animal. You could go on with that magazine for your entire life and not get all of the different families of animals. And it never occurred to me until I was an adult when I started realizing I didn't believe in God, that was a horrific, awful thing to do. Genocide of an entire planet. It's one of those things that I'm sure was floating around in the back of my head and probably floating around in the back of a lot of people's thoughts.
I think this is what the transparency of information is going to do. First of all, churches could always rely on the fact that most people would only read the parts of the Bible that you asked them to read. Only the scripture lessons that you chose would be presented and vivid for them. And there's a lot in there that they wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole if they could help it, because it's embarrassing. Well, more and more of the Bible is going to be just embarrassing. And as that happens, they're going to have to decide, what do we do? Can we expurgate the Bible? Can we have an abridged edition? What are we going to do about this? It's really, actually, I think, a significant embarrassment. I think that's the right word for many Christians, that their Bible has so much preposterous foolishness in it.
I agree with that. I, as a pastor, encouraged my congregation to read the whole Bible every year. In fact, we had these charts that you would read your little portion every day and check it off. But I eventually abandoned that because I kept getting questions from people that I couldn't answer within the confines of the faith I had to present. And this is one of those things where the questions that I wasn't allowing myself to ask, now they're coming to me from the congregation. One of the dear 89-year-old sisters who's raised her family and loves her family comes to me with her Bible in her hand, and I think, oh boy, this will be fun. And she says, what does it mean when Jesus says, if you don't hate your family, you can't follow the Lord? Well, what's the good answer there? What can you give that stays within the modicum of the Christian faith? What answer can't you? You can't. Yeah. And there are hundreds, maybe thousands of places in the Bible that lead to that. The very same type of question that your only answer is a bad answer.
Yeah.
There's a lot of mental gymnastics that people do even around just that passage, and I've heard several of them. I'm sure you've heard a lot of counters to that, and they don't quite make sense.
One of the things that I've been amused by in recent years since Breaking the Spell came out is when I've been interviewed on right-wing religious radio, and they find out that I advocate compulsory education on the world's religion for all school children, including homeschoolers and kids in religious schools, not just in the public schools. And just the basic facts about the religions, where they are, what they purport to believe, what their music and art and history is, and so forth. And again and again, I would find a radio preacher, in effect, bamboozled by me on this score because they know they hate it, but they can't figure out why. And I said, look, it's just facts. We're going to just teach facts. Don't you think the children in your church should know about other religions and about their own and about what people in other religions make of their own religion? Do you think you should prevent your children from knowing these facts? They're just plain everyday facts. And in the limit, they realize that, no, they don't own their children, and they have no right to shield their children from all this plain factual knowledge. It's not like pornography or something like that. But they realize that if they let the kids see that, then their whole method of indoctrination, of raising the children as Christians, has to be completely revamped. And they don't know how to do it.
As a former pastor, I can't tell you how. I would have been terrified of that. And I'll tell you why. Because, number one, the Bible says, train up a child in the way he should go. And the way we've always interpreted that is shelter them from anything that is outside of this and, just teach them this. But I also had pastored long enough that I realized when kids leave the fold, they go to school, they go to college, when they leave the home, we were losing them right and left. And the reason is because information that we had shielded them from is now readily available. And the backlash we got from that is they were pissed off. They're like, you lied to me.
Exactly. And I can't tell you how many times I've said to somebody, a creationist, and said, what are you going to say when your children or your grandchildren say, why did you lie to me about evolution? What are you going to say? Because they're going to find that out.
Absolutely, they will.
There was one seed that was planted in my mind as a kid. I think I was in 4th or 5th grade, so probably, 8 or 9 or 10 years old. And we were studying mythology, and we learned Greek and Roman mythology. And we studied it just as, here's what those people used to believe. And they had a god that had up on the mountain. They had gods that were in the underworld. And so immediately you're like, oh, it's like heaven and hell, only it's what they used to believe. And when you start to critique, why that other religion is not true, in one case, say the thunderbolts that Zeus throws down, you start to critique other belief systems. It's harder to keep from critiquing those same explanations in your own belief systems. Absolutely.
The other day I was talking with somebody, I can't remember which conversation this was. I guess it was on the radio. And the issue of the historical fact of one thing. Oh, yes, the assassination of Caesar in the Forum, that was a historical fact. And then there was the resurrection of Jesus, and that was a historical fact. And I said, well, let's talk about another historical fact. And that is the virgin birth of Julius Caesar. What? I misspoke? No. I said, that was a story that was going around at the time. In fact, there were a lot of virgin births back then. And this was an awkward reminder for this person that as long as you're making a list of the facts from antiquity, how about the fact that Julius Caesar, too, was born of a virgin.
Not all the facts of antiquity agree with Christianity. Just the ones we want to agree.
Just we want to, yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. I want to do something that I'm not sure anyone's ever done this before, but our podcast, most of the people, you're talking to 10,000 people right now, most of them, a slight majority, are still going to church, haven't come out even to their husband, wife, mom, dad, and they're trying to figure out, how do I reconcile my life where I am with the fact that I no longer believe? The other half are people who've already made that step, and now they're trying to reinvent their life. And it's a difficult process, as you absolutely know, through the Clergy Project and through other things. And what I want to do is just kind of turn you loose for a few minutes for whatever time you want to spend. What would you say to them? How would you encourage? What would you have to say to that person who's scratching his head saying, everything in life that I thought was true isn't, now where do I go?
Well, I think different strokes for different folks. I think some people, for one thing, if they have aged parents who would be heartbroken to learn this, maybe you don't have to tell them. Maybe let them live out their lives with a little illusion there. What I wouldn't want to do, though, is to get myself caught in pulling the wool over any children's eyes. Child asks, you better grit your teeth and say, this is a good opportunity right there. I'm going to tell you, grandson, granddaughter, I don't believe that. I don't believe it at all. I don't go around talking about it, but no, I don't believe that. That will be a great gift to those children, to have somebody in their family tell them that. And you don't have to add to it. You don't have to say, and you shouldn't either. Let them chew on the fact that you've said, no, I don't believe that. What they have to realize is what anthropologists realize. In the matter of religious belief, everybody's an outsider. Kids growing up, they hear their parents and grandparents, and they hear the adults say things, and they think, golly, do they believe these things? They don't know. The fact that it's in their native tongue, that it's their culture, they don't know who believes what. We all grow up in our religious cultures not knowing whether the adults mean this stuff or not. Is this like Santa Claus, or is this like science? And children are naturally curious about this, and they would probably, unless they were told it was an evil sin, they would probably go out behind the barn and, hey, what do you think? What do you think is really true? Do you think, really? Do our parents really believe in God or not? Well, all it would take is a little candor, a little honesty. You don't have to preach. Just shrug your shoulders and say, oh, no, I don't believe that.
I love that answer. I want to just throw a question at Deanna, and I don't normally do this, but back when you were having your questions about Noah's Ark, and I know Deanna's story, she went was dragged to, I think, a Methodist church or some church for years. But her attitude was people really didn't believe it. It was all just story time, and it was fun and everything. And then when she realized people really do believe this stuff, it was kind of shocking. What would you have felt if you had a grandfather that said, I really don't believe that?
I would have been really relieved, because I wouldn't be the only one that thought maybe this stuff was BS. And another strategy that people have talked about on many of the atheist podcasts, they'll talk about parenting as and raising free thinkers. And even without pushing your beliefs onto the child, just explaining that, well, I don't believe that's true, but some people believe that is, and other people believe this different thing. That kind of freedom of allowing them to see that not everybody has the same opinion allows them to kind of come to their own decisions. And, I think indoctrination is a terrible, terrible thing. And, I feel like I would have been a lot better off as a kid without that heavy indoctrination. And, if somebody had just said, well, not everybody thinks this stuff is true, because it's taught to you as truth.
I think that making a child feel guilty for wondering that in itself that's child abuse.
I believe so,
you
too.
You really shouldn't ever do that. Let them wonder about whatever they're going to wonder about. Keep their minds inquisitive and unafraid to challenge authority.
How do we reopen after you have been beaten into, and sometimes physically beaten into compliance, and the mind kind of shuts down? Then you begin questioning, how can we reopen that? Is that something we even know yet?
I don't know if we know. I think that it probably isn't as much of a problem as it seems. I think that a little bird can speak to somebody who's really been brainwashed and they just suddenly get it. I think just expose them to the truth and don't make a big deal of it. In fact, one of the things that I really feel quite strongly about when I talk with atheist groups is, look, we're winning, be patient. The tide has turned. It's happening faster than you could even imagine in many quarters. Don't overreact. Don't push harder than you have to. The churches are all running scared. Their own studies, when they do careful research, show that they're going to have a hard time hanging on to the children in their denominations. Be patient, be gentle with them, realize that this is very painful. Actually, one of my favorite bits in Breaking the Spell is where I imagine how pained we would be if aliens from space came to Earth and our children got so excited with everything that these aliens were doing that they didn't want to play baseball, they didn't want to play football, they didn't want to play guitars, they didn't want to do any of the things in our culture that we love because they were so busy doing whatever these aliens were doing. We'd see our whole culture evaporating in front of our eyes. Our children would be, the Pied Piper would be taking our children away, and we would all be frantic. And then you remember, that's the way people feel in their traditional religions. It's happening all over the world. Native cultures, through no evil intent on the part of the West, are succumbing to the natural, it is cultural imperialism of a sort. It's just, boy, you show people a chainsaw and an outboard motor, and it's very hard to get them not to appreciate that this is going to completely change their lives. And there are a lot of cultural items that are like chainsaws and matches and outboard motors.
There's a question that, I don't know, something that's kind of burning on me here lately, and I think you're the right person to talk to about it. It amazes me. I watched the other day a spacewalk where they, on the fly, created a way to move a pump, and it was fabulous on the space station how they were going through, and you watched the teamwork happening. It was fascinating to watch. And on one hand, I think we have the technology, we have the mental ability to build a station in space and to do things we never thought we'd have to do to it, and to go through the process, and we can do that. And yet, on the other hand, in your average year, we spend 10 times as much money killing each other as it would take to feed everyone. And I think we have such a huge disparity in the technology we have that is almost magical. And then on the other hand, we have the social and emotional abilities of apes, which is what we are. Is there a way to bridge that gap? Have we gone so far technologically that we can't that our species can't keep up with our species?
I don't think that's the way the technology plays into this. I think that no matter what technology we have around, as human beings, we have certain emotional needs. The need for company. We're very gregarious. We don't like to be alone. Lonely is one of the saddest words in the language. And people want company. They want to be part of a group. And if their group is threatened with dissolution, not by intentional forces, but just by the way new things are showing up. Keeping the old gang together is pretty hard. Expect people to be depressed, angry, frightened, hysterical, and expect them to be casting about for anything that will hold it all together. And we would be the same way if it was our own community, our own little group of friends. If we saw that under threat, we would be on the edge of panic. And I think we have to recognize that panic is the real enemy here, because when you start to get panic, when that awful dread feeling begins to rise in your body, you start doing crazy things. You lose your moral compass. You start lashing out and doing all sorts of stupid things. And we should recognize that there's no gentle way to prevent all the panic, because people are losing their culture, they're losing their community, they're seeing things that all their lives have been the most precious things to them, and they're seeing their children or grandchildren don't care a hoot about them. That has got to be a slap in the face of the worst sort, and what we should do is not be blackmailed by that. Not be blackmailed into caving in, and not, in particular, not caving in and letting the authoritarian figures in that community dictate how people are going to be in that community. We can't let the other people be enslaved by their leaders. But we should recognize that the pain is real, and we would feel it too under similar circumstances.
I think that's one of the more magical things about the free thought community in general, is that, we do have figures that we read their books and we look up to them, but we also have a very strong, it seems, need to infight and to critique each other and to say, well, that person may have said awesome things about atheism, but I hate what he said over here about that thing. And I'm just seeing it because I'm a part of the free thought community, but I have hopes that we're at least trying. We're making noises not to be as authoritarian as often those religious communities we came out of.
Here's an interesting reflection on that, which hadn't occurred to me before. We can afford to be open-minded now because things are going our way. I remember I was very active in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. And I remember that my great moral problem then was participating in anti-war activities and hearing some of the anti-war activists say things that were just preposterous, just outrageous. I knew they were false. And the question was I going to bite my tongue for solidarity? Or was I going to say, wait a minute, that's false? And at the time, the pressure was so severe, and I thought stopping this war is so important that very often I swallowed hard and did not criticize the really crazy things that people were saying. And, I think that's probably was the right moral decision at the time. Sometimes when a cause is very important, this is not a time for arguing everything out. Sometimes you want to just decide this may be the second best policy, but I'm just going to grit my teeth and go along with it because it's better than the dissolution of the whole group. Well, we should recognize that people of every faith, they're facing that too. And they're not just, they're not stupid, and B, they're not craven, they're not cowardly. When they decline to criticize some of the crazy things their leaders say, we should recognize that there are many motives for trying to preserve group solidarity with the hope, which may in many cases be completely forlorn and unrealistic, that they can quietly change things from within. I mean, you look at the Islamic world, and one of the great problems, I gather, from talking with Islamic friends of mine, is that there's no structure to Islam which makes it easy to reform it or keep power in check when particular Islamic leaders start to take over. And it's very hard for them to know what to do. It's not just that they fear being shunned or worse, much worse, but that they still have an allegiance, if not to the doctrines of Islam, to the culture of Islam. And if they could somehow set an example and reform it from within, that's what they would like to do, rather than just condemn it and abandon it. But those are hard choices, and we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking those aren't hard choices.
I can agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot about building community because I've said for a long time, people aren't going to leave their religion just because factually something, they're not going to walk away from that community. They're not going to walk away from grandmother, granddad, the whole community without another community to walk into. And I think you're talking a lot culture here, and just my own thought here is we're talking community, and maybe culture is something we ought to be talking as much as, if not more than, community itself.
I think how many of my friends are, for instance, cultural Jews? Don't believe a word of it, but they want to preserve the traditions, the rituals, the ceremonies, the bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. But that's what they want to preserve, not the creed. Of course, Judaism is particularly good for that, in that it's much more orthopraxy than orthodoxy. Harder to do that in. And although it is possible, my friend Brian Felsen, who's a musician and composer, has been writing atheist revivalist hymns, revival music.
Oh, really?
And some of it really rocks. And so we can imagine keeping the sort of camp meeting flavor and the music.
That's a word I hadn't heard in a while. Camp meeting.
But while getting rid of the creed.
I'm writing that down right now because that's somebody we need to talk to.
I like that a lot. I like that a lot.
Now, I'm curious how you ended up where you are now. What did you grow up with religion-wise? Did you have the indoctrination, the family religion, going to church all the time? Or what made you interested in talking about it and eventually rejecting it?
I grew up in New England suburbia, what I call a suburban Protestant, liberal. United Church of Christ was in the Congregational Church.
Right.
My mother didn't go to church, but she sent us to Sunday school. My grandmother was quite the churchgoer. My grandfather never went. So right from the beginning, it was clearly a mixed bag for our family. But my older sister went to seminary, and in fact, she is a United Church of Christ chaplain in Vermont right now.
How interesting.
And this creates some interesting tensions, but we're on very good terms, and I'm very proud of the work that she's doing. And she's really one of us, although she doesn't put it quite the way I would put it. And
I think
her example often helps me appreciate how possible it is for people to stay in the church, stay in their traditional church, and even in her case, be ordained. She doesn't do much preaching. That's she works in a hospice, and
I would love to do that kind of work.
And she does more good work than anybody I know.
Yeah. And so, that is, I did that as a pastor, a lot of that, and that is hard work, but it is so essential. As an atheist, I've said, there are some things churches do well.
Exactly.
And we need to develop that. We need to, hospice care. We need to offer that. Weddings. When someone dies, churches, they own that. But the reality is, that's where I feel like we need to step up. So there are things that churches do that where we need to step in.
Yeah.
And Rich has done a couple of fabulous, very moving, very heartfelt wedding ceremonies. He's done a memorial
service.
So have I,
by the way.
Awesome. Excellent.
Several of my graduate students have asked me if I would celebrate, preside over their weddings, which I've done.
That is awesome.
Isn't that wonderful?
Fun. Yeah, I'm thrilled to do it.
Yeah,
but it's a human thing. It's not
Absolutely.
A religion thing, and it's almost like we can, like you said of that guy that was in the AA, and he has a higher power, and then he realized, no, I had that power. When we as humans celebrate the humanity, it's like we're claiming that back, like we're saying it's ours again.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sorry to divert back. So after growing up in the United Church of Christ, obviously you ended up studying philosophy somewhere. Did that kind of facilitate you deciding that you didn't believe?
I think I lost my religious belief before I became a philosophy student, around the same time, freshman year, or maybe before that in high school, prep school. But, it's well known that adolescence is a time of intense interest in religiosity and religion. And I went through that period and nearly scared my mother half to death because I was going to a summer camp where there were a lot of Christian scientists. Oh. And they were very careful not to proselytize, but I, with my curiosity, got very interested and went to their meetings and read Mary Baker and the Key to the Scriptures, Mary Baker Eddy, and Science and Health and the Key to the Scriptures, and went and watched and witnessed some rather remarkable prayer healing, which I don't doubt for a minute, because it's a very potent placebo effect, and then sometimes that can do a wonder.
How interesting.
But I got interested in that, and then I sort of saw through that. And also, I was blessed, if I may say so, by United Church of Christ pastor in my town, who was such a pompous, self-righteous prig that the very sound of his voice turned me off. I can remember amusing my mother once. I came back from going to church, and she hadn't gone to church, of course, and she said, well, what was the service like today? And I said, well, I won't say his name. Some people might hear this and remember him more fondly than I do. And I say, well, the Reverend Dr. X was his usual bloated self. I said, I think when his wife asks him what he wants for breakfast, he says something like, I shall have eggs and bacon.
Yeah, I could see how that would do it.
I just couldn't, that man's voice rings in my ear to this day, and I just thought, this guy is the biggest jerk.
Where do you see the atheist movement, our species? Kind of give us what your perspective is of where things are going and how it's going to play out from here. I'm kind of asking you to look into a crystal ball, but...
Well, I don't know. Nobody knows, but I have a hope. I think there's a great job repurposing all the churches all over the country to play a very specific role. I've become deeply concerned about the fragility of the internet and the fragility of the power grid and everything that depends on the internet, and talking with some high-tech leaders, including people here in this town of Seattle, who are very much involved with it, who I know well, that we need, first of all, to create a backup system. Danny Hillis calls it Plan B, which divorces the power grid and other essential services from the internet. So if the internet ever goes down, those will have a backup system to keep them going. But I think every community needs a lifeboat. In fact, it needs more than one lifeboat. It needs a place which is local, with local people who know you and who have trained and thought about and brainstormed how to deal with a catastrophe. And it might not be the internet going down. It might be something like the Ebola plague, or it might be a terrible Katrina or something like that,
or this area, an earthquake,
or an earthquake and a tsunami. So I think that if churches would form committees and take on anybody in the community who had something to offer, and they could go right on giving their religious ceremonies if they want, but this would be one of the things that they would do, and they would take pride in the fact that they were a community resource. This moral teamwork is what churches do well, or can do well, and if this spread across the country, there would be something for churches to do that is a 21st century task of the first importance, a very valuable service, and nobody could do it better than they.
And a way of losing the doctrine and dogma without losing the culture.
That's right. And I can see this could be the tail that wagged the dog, and some churches would take longer to make the transition. Fine, take as long as you want, just as long as you serve this new purpose. You can do whatever ceremonies and have all the whatever you want, as long as you keep that part of it open.
Daniel Dennett, one of the Four Horsemen, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been fun.
That was an amazing conversation, and we are so lucky to have been able to do that. I'm Deanna Joy Lyons.
I'm Rich Lyons.
Come laugh with me.
You've been listening to the Living After Faith podcast, the official podcast of recoveringfromreligion.org. The music in this episode is Rose Cross by Morrison's Prophecy. You can follow on Twitter at LAF with me, like Living After Faith on Facebook, or go to livingafterfaith.com. Thank you for listening to Living After Faith.